Welcome to the Data Strategy Show. My name's Samir Sharma and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. Today's guest is Brent Dykes. He's a Senior Director of Insights and Data Storytelling at Blast Analytics. He is also the author of Effective Data Storytelling, How to Drive Change with Data, Narrative and Visuals. Brent has more than 15 years of enterprise analytics experience at Omniture, Adobe and Domo. His passion for data strategy and data storytelling comes from consulting with many industry leaders, including Nike, Microsoft, Sony, and Comcast. He is a regular Forbes contributor and has written more than 35 articles on different data-related topics. In 2016, Brent received the most influential industry contributor award from the Digital Analytics Association. He is a popular speaker at conferences such as Strata, Web Summit, Shop.org, AdTech, PubCon, Rise, Crunch, and Adobe Summit. Brent holds an MBA from Brigham Young University and a BBA in marketing from Simon Fraser University. We hope you enjoy today's podcast. Brent Dykes, thank you very much for being on the Data Strategy Show. Brent, you are the author of Effective Data Storytelling, and you started in the world of marketing, didn't you? So what I'd really like to understand, Brent, is marketing to data. What was your journey from marketing to data?
Yeah, I started out in marketing. I was actually in marketing communications. I was actually debating between accounting and going into marketing. Yeah,
okay.
and I actually
That's
did
quite
really
extreme.
well. Yeah, I know. It was kind of an interesting decision that I had to make, and I was doing very well in my accounting classes, which are based on numbers and math and data, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to buck the trend. I had a lot of friends who were doing well in accounting as well, and said, "Oh, you got to stay in accounting, man. That's once you get partner, you're set for life. There's you're good." But I just wasn't passionate about it, and so I decided to go with marketing. Got into a marketing communications role, and then kind of felt like I wasn't totally fulfilling all of my needs, maybe my data needs, you could say. And so I went to BYU, did my MBA, and then that's when I got my first exposure to kind of data when I was I worked at a retailer in the Midwest in their e-commerce, got into the running a paid search campaign, started doing analysis on that intrigued me. And then after graduating from the MBA program, I was hired on to a company called Omniture,
Right. Yes, I know.
which is digital analytics. One of the biggest. Yeah. And then they were acquired by Adobe in 2009. So that was kind of where I really got into doing, as a consultant. I spent 8 years as a consultant there, working with a lot of Fortune 500 brands, doing a lot of analysis. And the interesting thing was that when I first joined Omniture, I was in consulting, I was doing a lot of presentations, and I wanted to blog. And I don't know if you remember back in the blog.
I remember blogging.
Yeah, you still do it, but
yeah, it's a fun thing.
It was kind of just taking off then. And I actually approached the company, could I blog for the company? And they said no. They actually wanted to leave it to just the executives and Josh James. And so I was like, oh man, that kind of sucks. So I started up a blog of my own called PowerPoint Ninja, and started blogging there. And that was kind of my exposure to writing, but it kind of emphasized my, one side of me is I'm really good at PowerPoint and really good at presenting and communicating, and then having this career in data and stuff. And then that's when things started to come together where I was like, you know what, a lot of people struggle with communicating insights and data effectively. I saw that everywhere. And, as a consultant and working with other clients and other consultants, I saw that as a real challenge. And so that was when, and I think it was back in 2014, 2013, I pitched to the Adobe Summit that I could do a session on data storytelling.
Right.
And I had to kind of sell my story, so to speak, and was able to get them to agree to it. And that kind of started this whole journey that I've gone down with data storytelling. But it comes from my background in marketing.
In marketing, yeah, of course.
In doing the PowerPoint stuff.
Yeah. So from almost an accountant to a marketing comms expert to a PowerPoint ninja, which is quite far from where you were thinking of, and
Yeah.
into data storytelling. Why don't you give me a view of, just for those people who haven't read the book yet, what is data storytelling in its most rawest sense, and why do we need it?
Yeah. Well, I think my go-to on that would be the three pillars of data storytelling. And I think there's no surprise when people hear me say, okay, it's a combination of data, narrative, and visuals. And what I do in the book, you'll see in the book, you probably saw it there, is I have a Venn diagram that I use,
yes,
where I talk about the intersection of these three bubbles. And I think that really speaks to the power of data storytelling, and to kind of explain what it is. If we have the data bubble, and if we think about data, if I was to share just the raw data with somebody, there's a good chance that they're going to not interpret it the right way.
Sure.
They're not going to get the same insights that I got out of it. And so what do we need to do? We need to combine narrative with the data. And really, that's where we're explaining the numbers. We're helping the audience to understand. We're almost acting like a guide, we're saying, hey, here's how to interpret the numbers. So that's the first thing, that combination of narrative and data. On the other hand, if we look at the bubble, with the data bubble combining with the visuals, why do we need visuals? Well, if I gave you, again, a raw data table, there's a good chance you're not going to see the anomalies, you're not going to see the patterns or the trends in the data. And it's only when we visualize the information that we can really start to see things. And so we're enlightened by those visuals. And then the last intersection of the other two bubbles, narrative and visuals, as human beings, we love visual storytelling. That's why we watch, TV shows and movies and play video games. That's all about the narrative. It engages us at a very deep level as human beings. And so what I like to say is when we combine the right data with the right narrative and the right visuals, we've got something very powerful, something that can really change the way people see the world. It can change their behaviors, their attitudes. And that's really what we need to do with our insights. If we're communicating insights effectively, we really, and this is something that it kind of hit me in the face, is when I was writing the book. I was like, wait a second. Every time we share an insight, what are we doing? We're basically saying, this doesn't work. We need to fix it. Or this is working great. We need to do more of it. But we're basically saying we need to change what we're doing. And so every time we introduce an insight, we're introducing change. And as we know, change is hard sometimes. There's going to be resistance to it. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be, oh, really? And so we're constantly, it really comes down to how we communicate the insight. If we can do it in a compelling, engaging way, then there's a better chance that our insights will be adopted, will be embraced, and we'll actually see value from them.
So, that's quite a lot to unpack, because, most of the times, and I think I'm going to be quite sort of straight up around. We often, as data professionals, as people who are working with our clients, I often see so many bad visualizations, really bad visualizations. No, I'm telling you, really, it's not even focused on a narrative. It's not even focused on an outcome or an action or a decision. And you talk about think fast and slow, and system 1 and system 2. Why do we continue to do the same things with data? And why is it that even if you have the best tools and the best products and all of the data, you still can't extrapolate what you want and be able to tell that narrative in a way that is going to help that individual see the change or understand what is going to happen or might happen? Why do we still fall into those traps? Because there's lots of people through the years, let's face it this way. We as human beings have grown up with stories, right? I can see the stories behind you. The fantastic comics that I grew up, that you grew up and, still continue to read. There's a narrative there. There's a story. And in fact, maybe uh, maybe the fact that we depend too much on technology now has become a hindrance for the way that we actually convey stories. Because for me, and I'll just reference your book. What I love about the book, and here it is for all those people out there who have never got it. You must get this book, Data Storytelling by Brent Dykes, who's on the screen right now. Plug. You talk about, you know, the triumvirate of the classic Star Trek program. You know,
Yeah.
you've got Captain Kirk, you've got Spock, the logical, robotic, you know, always predicates his life on
he's a data scientist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you've got Dr. McCoy, who's emotion, passionate, and, you know, all of that. And Captain Kirk has to be both of them gelled, and, you know, he's had a mind meld with Spock, and he's had a few beers with McCoy, and he's able to bring that to life. What have we just become robots because we think that a piece of technology is going to give us the answer? I mean, I
think one of the big challenges that we have is, you know, kind of looking past like the curse of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
For us, it's very hard for us to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else and say, you know, how are they going to interpret this? You know, and I go back to really, I think a big challenge that we have is, obviously we have all these great tools that are very powerful that we can explore the data. We create all these really interesting, crazy visualizations that work for us, right? They work for us. We know the data inside and out. And I think the biggest challenge that we have is really that transition from the exploratory phase of analysis to an explanatory,
right?
You know, and that may mean taking that visualization that speaks to us. You know, we love this; it's so clear to us, and maybe stepping back from it and say, okay, I'm going to be presenting this to the marketing team, and so, oh, wait a second. You know what? This data here is not needed. I'm going to take that away. That's noise. You know what? And then there's some other points in here. You know, maybe I'll shorten the time frame because really, that's outside of the, you know. And so you start to do this. I call it editing, right? We're almost like editing the charts and the visuals that we share with other people. And a lot of times, I think what happens is we don't do that editing. We assume that what communicated to us will communicate equally well to the executives.
Sure.
Or will communicate equally well to other employees that may not, again, they haven't spent all the time in the data like we have. They may not be as familiar with some of the visualizations that we're familiar with. They don't know the data. They don't know maybe the context. They may not have full context. I mean, we may have spent hours, days, weeks in this data. And so we can see things in the numbers that many other people, you know, for them, they'd look at it and I'm not seeing what you're seeing. And so what do we have to do? Oh, well, let me push all this to grayscale. Let me highlight here the trend that you should be seeing. Oh, okay, now I see it.
Yeah.
You know, it's those little edits that we need to do to help other people see the insights that we've discovered. And I think that's where I think that's a common contributor to why a lot of the, you know, we see a lot of problems out there with data communications in general.
And it's interesting that you talk about data communications and that small nub of the insight, and you and I and others, like you said, have probably been in that data for so long, looking at, you know, the finest details, understanding what happened here, or, you know, why did it happen, and, you know, what were the products that might have made it to happen, or, you know, sales or whatever it might have been. And then that's us interpreting it, yeah. But another person who looks at it has a different angle, has a different view, has a different take on that same data. Do we need to put data storytelling in the same mold as data literacy?
I would say I kind of see data literacy as the bigger umbrella, right? That yes, I think that data storytelling is a part of data literacy, but it's, you know, to think that if just by training somebody on statistics, training them on the data, how to interpret charts and different things, automatically they know how to communicate. No, I think it's the same, like in our literary world. I kind of think it, you know, having somebody being able to read a book and maybe, write an email, some basic literacy skills is different than somebody explaining a topic or something effectively to somebody else. And I think,
Yes.
so in my book, I talk about how, the first step is data literacy. If you're not data literate yourself, it's going to be very hard for you, meaning that you don't know how to interpret the numbers, you don't know how to interpret charts, you don't know how to create charts. Those are basic skills that I assume when you pick up my book, I'm not going to teach you how to be those things. However, then I think it's a skill, like to actually get better at communicating data and sharing it in a way that's meaningful and impactful and engaging to other people. I think that's a skill that's kind of, it's a part of data literacy, but it's kind of a muscle that you need to build up and get better at.
And I see in a lot of the examples that you've got in the book, doctors looking or looking at the birth rates and death rates and so on, and nurses actually doing a better job than but the data wasn't conveyed in the right way back then. What is it? Because you also talk about and I only referenced it this week, but I do reference it quite often. I remember working for a very large firm before I started my company, and there were practical issues around the delivery of items that would go out to people. And what we found in the data, it was the last mile of, that's where the issue was. It wasn't the sort of legit, the supply chain bit before that was fine. When it got to the last mile, it all went to pot. You often talk about the last mile in data storytelling then. So how do you turn that into it's very much a psychological issue, I think. You talk about psychology in the book quite a lot as well. So do we have to really understand that last mile and the psychology of how the brain works, and how neuroscience is not forming, but how we form our brains, and how that's telling us what we need to learn and understand? And how do I convey that then to a person who has never really, doesn't know enough about that piece of data or whatever it might be? How do we really get the essence of that across in that last mile? How do you get over it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at this journey that we take with analytics and data science. We start with the collection of the data, right? That's the first thing. Then we have to prepare, process that data, aggregate it. And then what's the next step? We usually visualize it in dashboards, reports. And then now we're getting to the last mile where we're pivoting from data and technology to what I think are people and outcomes. Right. We're trying to drive outcomes from this. And so that's why we have to solve this problem through understanding human psychology, both from two perspectives. There's this perspective of me,
right,
and the biases and the cognitive biases and the logical fallacies that I might introduce to the picture, and me wanting to convey things. And then on the receiving end, the audience and the people that we want to act on the insight, how are they going to interpret the data? How do they perceive things? And, obviously I talk a lot about in the book about neuroscience and how narrative has a very different path to the brain than facts and data. Facts and data.
Well, you talk about statistics versus stories. Right. Which is what I love, because I'm a stories guy. I'm not a statistics guy, but I'm a data guy. But I would be able to tell a story beautifully, but you put a bunch of statistics in front of me, I wouldn't remember them.
Right.
So is it really more about emotion then? Is it more about the fact that we have to be emotionally connected? And maybe that goes back to your marketing principles. How, as a marketing communications expert, do you emotionally connect with people in order for them to change? So your arc, I'm not talking about your storytelling arc, we'll come to that in a minute, but your arc from marketing to data actually seems very logical, from marketing to storytelling, because
Yeah.
you are doing that as a marketer, right?
Yeah, I think there are some unique benefits to having come from a marketing background and having done the communication side.
Mm,
And what does that teach? Traditional marketing, before, I would say I entered into marketing before data really took off. I mean,
right.
there was market research,
Mm-hmm.
and as I was talking to another person who graduated the marketing degree, she actually was talking to her professor, and then her professor said, "Yeah, that's marketing research is the way to make the least amount of money in marketing."
Oh God, it's probably true.
It's true. At the time, it was true.
Yeah.
And there was no, analytics and data
Sure.
analysis really
Sure.
didn't really live outside of,
Mm,
market research, maybe a little bit of direct marketing. They were a little bit more analytical, but now I would say, those skills that I gained as a marketer actually
yeah.
probably helped me as a data storyteller. Because what do they train you in marketing? They train you to think about the audience, to think about
Yes.
the target market, the customer, very customer centric. And so what is that about? That's about empathy. That's
Mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
understanding what the audience, and I think maybe that's a good perspective that I brought to this
Mm,
profession,
mm, mm.
getting into analytics in the data world, is that I had this traditional training of thinking of the end consumer, the target market, the target audience, and then how do we connect what we're trying to convey to them
And
so they can act on it.
yeah, and I see that so much in everything that I have had to learn in my company as a way to convey what we do, or how we do it, or how we express ourselves. So I see the importance. And I've only begin to understand. I've only understood that over a period of time.
Mhm.
But essentially, in the book, you actually have heavily researched the mind, the brain, the way it works. A lot of people don't have time to do that.
Mhm.
So in a very simple um, number of ways, you describe how to tell an effective data story. So tell us a little bit about your data storytelling arc. What is it? And if I haven't read the book, or if I'm a layperson out there and saying,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I look at numbers every day and I can tell you what this means and I can convey that. But, if I want to get my business case off the ground, if I want to get my new analytics product, and I need to tell a story, why we need it, what are the benefits, what would
Mhm.
you say to that individual, and how would the arc, the storytelling arc help?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we have when we do our analysis, we find a lot of interesting observations and insights. And then what do? We kind of like dump it onto people.
Yeah.
We just start spewing
Yep.
information, and
Yep.
sometimes those, oh, that's interesting, and then almost like, you watch the eyes glaze over, and you leave the meeting hoping that your audience has understood and got your main points, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't, because you took this kind of like data dump approach. And
Yeah.
so I think what the narrative component, and I would say is the differentiator of my book. My book is not a data visualization book.
No, not at all. Yeah.
It does, I do cover those
Yes, you
concepts.
do.
I
You
have a
do.
couple of
Yeah.
chapters, but
Yep.
by no means would I say my book is the
Yep.
definitive book
Yep.
on data visualization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I think is the difference about my book is I focus a lot more on the narrative, and you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned this
Mm-hmm.
arc that I use, and I
Mm-hmm.
think having a narrative arc or model or framework that you can use to kind of, what it helps you to do is, okay, you've got this big pile of data, you've got all these interesting observations and insights, and what it's going to help you to do is have structure to that,
Yep.
to say, you know what, okay, let's go through this process.
Mm-hmm.
What is the main takeaway? I talk about in the book the aha moment.
Yes. Yep.
What is, if your audience left your presentation and just remembered that one thing, what would that be?
Mm-hmm.
What are
Mm-hmm.
you trying to influence? So
Mm-hmm.
that becomes the climax, if you will,
Yep.
of your data story.
Yep.
Now, we don't start with the climax.
No.
That's how you would do an executive summary.
You'd give it away.
You'd give it away. There's no build up. There's no
Yes.
emotion. There's no
Yeah,
connection.
that's
No
it.
storytelling.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I'm not. So where do we begin?
Yeah.
The next most important thing, I think, is your hook.
Yeah.
And your hook is, and let me give you an example of a hook. A hook
Mm-hmm.
would be that first observation that when you were doing your analysis, you went, oh, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
something that caught your attention that was like, oh, that's weird, or that's interesting, or that's exciting, or that's it. You know, there's
Yeah.
a metric that went up really,
Yes.
really big
Yep.
or decreased, and so that would be the launching of your story that's going to capture the attention of your audience. They're like, oh, we want to know why those customers spent twice as much as they typically did last month.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Mm-hmm.
And so that hook is really critical. Now,
Mm.
with that hook, I talk about establishing a little bit of the setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
What that means is providing a little bit of the context
Mm-hmm.
so that people can fully appreciate that hook. You know, if we said, you know, customers are spending double, what is the normal amount that they spend? Oh, they spend this much. Oh, okay. And they've spent that much for the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So this month where they doubled, that's amazing. You know, you put the hook or the insight or the observation that you're sharing with them in context. And then now your next job with this narrative arc is to introduce, kind of like an onion, right? You start peeling
Yeah.
the layers of the
Yep.
onion to kind of you know, how do we get at this aha from the hook? We share, oh, well, these customers are now shopping for these products, which is they're also buying this particular brand. Oh, interesting. Oh, okay. So that's what's contributing to this big spike that we had here, and why we need to invest money in targeting. So, and then the last part, I'll just finish off
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When we get to the climax, the aha moment, then it's like, okay, so what? What do we do with this? Where do we go with this? So we've identified a problem that we need to address, or we've identified an opportunity that we need to pursue. What do we do about it? And I think that's a big focus of my book. I'm about driving change with data, not just sharing the insights and, oh, that's a pretty chart. Okay, thank you. No, it's like, okay, in that last stage of the arc, it's like, okay, what are the options that we have? Well, you could do A, B, or C.
Yeah.
And we recommend A, and then that's kind of like the full.
I often talk about things like, you know, around decision intelligence, and, you know, everybody's focused on the data, but they're not worried about that last mile. And I think, you know, you and I absolutely resonate on that sort of last mile. And actually, I was looking in your LinkedIn profile earlier, and I picked up a quote, a quote. Obviously, you've written it, and it's, you know, but you said, nothing pains me more than seeing good insights go to waste. You know, and it's absolutely true that how many good insights are probably lost due to the fact that the individual is probably quite egotistical in the way that they want to convey this data. So, you know, for me, it's almost like the driving change piece and the exploratory to explanatory. I don't think people make that leap to the explanatory. And I don't know whether they're thinking that their numbers should be driving change. So the question is, how do you get data scientists, data analysts, data, you know, developers? How do you get them to work within that context and really, you know, explain the fundamentals that, you know, you've got your analysts, you've got your analytics teams, you've got data scientists, you've got the business people. They really have to get to know each other, right? So the change you're talking about is actually probably extraordinary human change. How do you affect that in organizations when you go in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to make investments not just in the technology and the data side, but in these relationships. You know, one of the things I talk about is understanding the audience, right?
Yes.
Imagine how critical it is, and I think often, on the analytics side, we're so wrapped up on the data and the technology and the technical details of what we're doing that we fail to realize, you know what, who am I presenting this information to? What are they going to care about?
Yeah.
You know, is it a data savvy audience where they're very data literate, or no, I'm going to have to hold their hand. They're barely data literate, you know, and I'm going to have to change up my style. So I think it's, you know, it's thinking beyond the technology, beyond the data, beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, what works for us, because obviously we're data literate. We understand the data, but putting it into, you know, empathy and thinking of the audience, I think that's a critical, you know, if there's anything I can encourage analytics professionals, data science professionals to do is to think more of the audience, think more of, because at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, you could have done an amazing job on the analysis. You got all these data sets to come together. You did some amazing statistical modeling, which showed that there's this unique opportunity in the market that nobody else has discovered. It's, and I think the mistake that we often think is that the numbers speak for themselves. They don't. They don't. They need a narrative. They need a storyteller. They need somebody to guide the audience through. In my book, I also talk about, how we're almost like a tour guide. That we're leading the, and I share an example where my wife and I, a few years ago, went to Italy, and we had the chance to go to Pompeii. And if you think about Pompeii, if you've ever been there or heard of it, I mean, there's so many things you can see.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And we were on a cruise, so we had to be back at the boat. So we had only I think 2.5, 3 hours. And we booked our trip with a tour guide, and they'd taken us down the Amalfi Coast. And then the last part of it was to go to the Pompeii site. Now, what they arranged for my wife and I and another couple was to have our own personal guide.
Fantastic.
And this guy was an archaeologist student.
Perfect.
And so he maximized our time at that site, and he took us to places, that were interesting to us. And it was funny as he was the guy's name was Marcello. As Marcello was kind of explaining the frescoes and all this, we were noticing other tourists kind of like, leaning in to kind of hear what he was talking about, because they're just like wandering around. Maybe they had a book or a guidebook or something, but they really had no clue what was going on. Marcello could take us and explain things, and it was such a great experience.
He could draw you in, right?
And that's the same thing that we have with our data. We could say, hey, here's a great data set. Here you go. Just dive in there and you'll find some amazing thing. And then they kind of poke around. They don't know where to go. So what are we doing with a data story? Well, we're the tour guide. Look at this. And then, did you know that this was connected and this and this and this, and so we're acting as a guide through the labyrinth of of
data,
rows and columns of data.
And I've got to say, I don't know whether it's become an impact or an aspect of it, but data democratization to me has probably led to a lot of the fallacies that you've just talked about. The fact that I could give a user a data set and suddenly they will come out with nuggets of knowledge and insight, and off they go to create some new revenue stream or product. I think that's something like, it's a bit of a tech myth that we are able to do that instantly. So there's got to be something around. I like the way that you attach it to change, and the fact that you talk about the last mile and communicating data, which is really important. But where do we start with that? Do we have to go back in the education system? Because a lot of people have talked about data literacy, but equally, do you need to then bring data storytelling into schools in order for it to be understood later? And that, I think there was something else, in an article, I think you tweeted the other day, and the narrative was that, we don't need to learn more about tech. We need to learn more about stories and conveying information. So is it the right place for it to be? Do we need to go back to fundamentally the origin of education?
I two points on that. One is, yes, I think that, I did a presentation on data literacy, and I discovered there's a lot of thought around how our education in math is taught today. The pinnacle of our math pyramid is calculus, not statistics. Not statistics that actually would be something that many students would actually use later on in their lives, just as, even with our elections and things, as we're analyzing data. So I think we need to change. There needs to be a change in education to teach the math skills that actually, are in this century, not in the last century. And then I think the other thing that needs to happen, now that doesn't help all of us who are
already
18 or older.
Past that road.
So unless you're in college, I mean, but so how do businesses, how do corporations help people to get those skills? And I think that there may be some internal training programs and different things that can build up those skills. A lot of us had statistics in college and maybe a little bit rusty, or maybe even some of us didn't get any exposure to statistics. And arithmetic, basic, algebra and arithmetic. And it's interesting. I was listening to a couple of data scientists, and they said, you think that, we're doing all this crazy stuff, but a lot of it is just, basic arithmetic and algebra. For a lot of the stuff we do.
And were they saying that in private? Because I've never heard anybody say that in public.
No, seriously, no. It was in a TED talk. I was reviewing a TED talk, and the guy was like, I'm a data scientist. People think, and he showed, this chalkboard filled with all these, crazy equations, and he said, "This is what my friends and a lot of people think I do." And then he brought up another slide that just showed plus sign, division, subtraction, And that's the majority of what I do.
And I just remembered that quote because I misquoted it. It was, we don't send our children to school to become computers. We send them to school to become more creative.
Right.
And I think that's the bit which we've lost probably. We are so dependent on the output of an algorithm or of a visualization that we have become less creative as individuals. And probably, the right and left brain, the logical side tends to probably take over too much in the way that we operate, unless you are in advertising or marketing or somewhere where you are connecting with people. So it's probably safe to say that those people who are data scientists, analysts, anybody needs to convey information, they need to start getting more creative or more empathetic, as you said, in and understanding the individuals that they are conveying information to. Pretty difficult for some of those people who are introverts and who wouldn't be able to do that. So I think it's still a tough call. So does that mean, because a lot of people talk about this new role called a data storyteller, Is that needed then to bridge the gap between the data scientists, those the left brain logicals, introverts? Not saying that all data scientists are introverts, probably a bit of a myth, but do we need that new position? Do companies need to onboard types like that, these creative types?
I think initially, maybe yes. I think I view data storytelling as a skill that everybody's going to eventually need to have. But as we go through this transition where, this is a new skill set, I published a post about this, that I think having some dedicated data storytellers or some people kind of leading the way on data storytelling can help foster curiosity in other people, can help people to kind of become more data literate almost, because if you think about our children, what do we do to our children when they're just, in kindergarten and just starting to read? We read to them, so we read them books, and then that starts to get them excited or interested in reading on their own. And I think the same thing happens with organizations. There may be situations where if you can promote and have certain data storytellers sharing these stories, all of a sudden people go, "Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that about this customer, or I didn't know that about that part of the business. I wonder what I could find out in my," and so then they start to, get curious. They maybe advance their data literacy skills so that they can then in turn at some point start to share data stories on their own. So yeah, I do think that it may be a role that is a kind of a transitional role. Eventually down the road, it may be where most people have these skills to different levels, but I think it's a skill set that we're all going to need at some point.
So you've written Effective Data Storytelling. You've also written a couple of other books. Is there a new one making its way to the bookshelf soon?
Probably not. I think I'm in recovery mode. My wife, she doesn't love it when I write books because it's all consuming and it's a lot of work. The one thing I am planning on doing is building out an online course based on this book. And
Perfect.
so that'll be the next thing that I
Yeah.
do.
Great.
So that people, if they want to get trained up to develop these skills and kind of get a little bit more examples and learn these skills, then that's going to be the next thing that I offer. And then from there, we'll see. I write for Forbes,
Yes.
so that's an outlet that I write for. I also publish blog posts for my company, Blast Analytics. Yeah, so always writing.
So there's lots of places people can find you, find your
Yeah.
content. Obviously, they can buy your book.
Yes.
And get to understand, and you can see all my marks in there, and the bits which fascinating. I love the book, and I think one of the things that I'll always take away, which is something for me that as a child I used to do a lot of, which was writing, and I still take a pen and I still put it to paper, and that intrigues. That's sort of the connection between my brain and my hand is actually, it flows better. So I think for me, what you've talked about in terms of the basically the individuals, if we can get people to understand that from an educational perspective early on in their lives, that would be great in terms of the data storytelling. But I think one of the things that I take away from your book is that, listen, and from presentations that you've done, stories are memorable, and they always will be.
Yeah.
And I could probably, recount stories from 20 years ago that I've heard, from one evening of meeting somebody at a party, and they told me this wild story, and it will always stick. So I think as data professionals, we often not telling wild stories, obviously, because wild stories about data might not be possible. But I think that's fundamentally for me, that's what comes through from the book, and getting people to think in a more focused manner, understanding that the arc that you talked about, the pivot, the fact that you need to have a hook, and peeling that onion is absolutely important to build up. It's like you're building up, to that arc of the story. What's the aha moment, and there it is, and suddenly everybody's got you, and you're done. So on that note, I'd really like to thank you, and for being on the show. It's been fantastic to speak to you. Fantastic to understand more about data storing in the context of now, but obviously for the future, and what we need to do for the for the next generations that are out there, because data is not going away. But let's not focus on data. Let's focus on the output, the storytelling, the decision making. And hopefully that'll be where we get to. But I'm sure in the future it'll be some AI that will tell us what to do.
Eventually.
But thank you so much. Any last things that you want to offer up to the viewers about data storing, telling, or maybe something about the two comics behind you?
Yeah, I mean, so my passion, early when I was a teenager, I collected comic books and loved the artwork, loved the stories. And it's interesting, if you think about data storytelling, what is it? It's visual storytelling. And that's exactly what comics do, and actually I'm actually thinking of doing a blog post or an article on what comic books can teach us about data storytelling.
Fantastic.
You think about it, there's annotations,
yes,
there's the flow of these visual images and all kinds of things there. So I'm planning on doing a blog post or an article on that. Should be fun.
I'm looking forward to that, and I think you should come out with a comic book as well. Maybe
we'll
the
see.
Data storyteller. Okay, well, look, on that note, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on the show, and I look forward to reading all of your Forbes articles, and and those the blog on the comic book, and all of the other things that you're doing. So good luck with it all, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Samir. Take care. Bye-bye.